This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. Today's episode is another installment of Make, Remake. It's where we take a movie and its remake and compare the two. Not to see which one is necessarily better or worse, but to see how two movies can tell the same story both similarly and differently. In the past, we've paired such films as The Invisible Man, Old Boy, Rebecca, and others. On today's show, we're considering the 1984 David Lynch-directed Dune and the 2021 version directed by Denis Villeneuve. Dune is based on a 1965 novel by Frank Herbert, which is considered the highest-selling science fiction novel of all time. Herbert wrote 5 additional entries into the Dune series, and there have been numerous more not written by him. Originally, a film adaptation was worked on by experimental Chilean filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, but ended up being cancelled after the budget grew too big. Later on, producer Dino De Laurentiis acquired the rights to the film, and after seeing The Elephant Man, hired David Lynch to direct it. Despite author Frank Herbert being generally pleased with the movie, it bombed at the box office for being too confusing and weird. Since a lot of the novel takes place inside the main character's mind, it is often said to be an unfilmable book. In 2000, there was a miniseries adaptation of the novel, which allowed more room for the story to breathe, and it was a modest success. But in 2017, Canadian director Denis Villeneuve was brought on board to direct an adaptation of the book. He agreed to do it on the condition that the first novel be split up into 2 parts to make it work. Part 1 was originally scheduled to be released in November 2020, but due to COVID, it got pushed back to October 21st, 2021. After a strong opening weekend, Part 2 has been greenlit and is expected to come out in 2023. Joining me today to talk about the 2 version of Dune is the show's resident geek expert, Sammy Felchenfeld, who was last heard on an episode Better Know a Contributor back in May. Sammy, how are you doing today?
I'm good, and I can't believe it's been so long.
I know, it's been quite a while. We haven't found the right subject matter for the two of us to come back together.
Anyone who's listened to me on this has known that I've just been waiting to talk about Dune.
Yes, that's very true, and it's something that I feel like we've been discussing for well over a year now.
Very true.
But yeah, so I figured you'd be a perfect person to bring on because, one, like I said, you this is your area of expertise with the science fiction stuff, and I know you've read the original book and are a fan of it, and just the fact that you are so excited for this movie made you kind of the perfect person to bring on. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today.
My planet Arrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low. Rolling over the sands, you can see spice in the air. The outsiders ravage our lands in front of our eyes. Their cruelty to my people is all I've known.
Well, like I said at the top, we're going to explore how things are done similarly and differently. And so let's start things off with how they're done differently between the 2 versions. While we won't be intentionally spoiling the movie, if you haven't seen at least one version of Dune, I suggest holding off until you listen to this show. So the big first thing that is done differently is the very nature that David Lynch's version covers the whole first book, so to speak, while Denis Villeneuve is splitting his up into 2 parts. So what we've been told is basically Part 1 of Dune covers roughly the first half of the movie, the first half of the book, sorry, and then Part 2 is going to cover the second half of it. So that's a pretty big difference, and I wonder if the fact that the movie's been getting a positive reception has to do with the fact that, it's such a big unwieldy source material, if by virtue of the fact of breaking it up into 2 versions makes it a lot more palatable and easier to digest the information that's coming across, as opposed to Lynch's, who crammed everything into 1. So I'm sort of interested to sort of see how you feel about doing it that way, and if it's working so far.
Yeah, I think to illustrate that, I want to share a couple of quotes. The first I'm going to share is Frank Herbert's comment on the film. Like you said, he did view it favorably, but there's a famous wording he used. The movie begins as Dune begins. He doesn't say the movie is my book. He says it starts the same as my novel starts, which is true of the 1984 version. And then to also use another quote is Villeneuve saying in a few interviews that the first movie is setting up the world, and the second movie is now he can play in the sandbox. There's so much explanation done, although in some ways sparsely in the first movie, that he doesn't have to introduce a whole lot of stuff in the second book, in the second movie, pardon me, that I think is to the huge benefit of the way this is being done. And I think it's no surprise that the year 2000 miniseries somehow made on a $20 million budget. It looked like it was, but it was very, very faithful. Not the best acting. There's a lot of problems with it, but it is a big story. It needs to be told in a big, big way. And Jodorowsky wanted to make a 10 to 14 hour movie, which, given the book, kind of makes a little bit of sense. So some credit to Villeneuve for making a 2.5 hour movie for part one. I can't see part two being any longer than that. It doesn't really need to be, because so much groundwork has been laid.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it, because, we know all the main players for it. We're going to talk about later on some characters that appeared in the Lynch one that didn't appear in the Villeneuve one, and that's a bit of a difference. But other than introducing those people, we know basically all the main people. We know the Atreides family. We know the Harkonnen family. We know what's generally happening with the Fremens and stuff like that. So that's a great base level to really start at. And so it's just interesting how watching the Lynch version, which is just a hair over 2 hours. I think it's a 2 hour and 15 minute, or at least the version I watched is. I know there's been re-releases where it's over 3 hours, but the version I watched was about 2 hours and 15 minutes, I think. And the first hour 30 is basically beat for beat what happens in part one of Dune. So in that last 45 minutes, they cram everything in that is going to be part two of Dune. So that's done very interestingly, because I was watching, I'm like, what did Lynch add to this that Villeneuve didn't get to? And then, of course, finally, I realized where the cutoff happened, and you're basically at the third act of the Lynch film. So that's something that I think that played out interesting.
And in the book, you're roughly halfway, but you're not even quite at halfway. So the book is broken into 3 parts, or 3 books basically. They were written originally, book 1, which is basically everything up until this is a nearly 60-year-old book, so I'm sorry if you really don't know this, but the siege of Harkin, which is that city, which they actually never name in the movie, but the city where the Atreides are. The book 1 ends, or part 1 ends there, and that's when Herbert's first serial ends. And then he wrote 2 more serials that became parts 2 and 3, and then he kind of expanded and really fleshed out to make the actual book. So parts 2 and 3 are Flight into the Desert, and then I won't go into much of book 3, but Lynch's film kind of skips a bunch of important beats of, like it does say, okay, 2 years passed, which is in the book, I think it's 3 years, but it does talk about those pieces. But you're right, the first half of the book is pretty beat for beat for the first major chunk of the Lynch movie. And so what the problem is that, again, like I was saying that Villeneuve was talking about, the playground has now been set up by doing all of these pieces. And I feel that Villeneuve didn't leave anything out that's not vital to what you need to know for the second half, which, again, we'll talk about those characters as well, which was an interesting choice, but I think a smart choice. I was talking about this with my partner the other day. I still have a lot of love for the original movie, even though it's not great. It's wonky. There's a lot of really problematic things that they do. There's some choices that are made. And it's not really a huge surprise that David Lynch basically didn't want his name attached to certain versions of the movie, and for some time the movie at all. So I think that there's a straight, like, it's like you said, people have called it unfilmable because it takes place in mostly in Paul's head. And I think that Villeneuve at least was able to, there's not a huge amount of dialogue in this movie, which I kind of noticed. There's a lot of sweeping vistas of sand. And there's a lot of things that are sort of kind of, as me as a lover of the book, I was smiling most of the time, being like, that's a tiny thing that I'm going to notice, and a lot of other people won't. It doesn't take anything away, but it does add to someone watching this just for the experience. Whereas David Lynch got us Fade / Sting in a bikini. So
yes. Yeah, I think a good thing to kind of talk about is maybe the use of narration, specifically inner monologues, that is very present in the Lynch version, where, very often we'll have like a main character where maybe you can hear their thoughts, or they'll be narrating it, or things like this, where it seems like in Lynch's version, almost every single character you get to hear inside their head of what they're thinking, what their process is going on inside them. And that's completely not there at all in the Villeneuve one. I think that they don't even show, like, do they have Paul's inner monologue at all? I can't quite remember. It's been a few weeks since I've seen it.
They don't include any of it, and I think that's probably one of the key biggest differences from a narrative standpoint. And Blade Runner is a big example for this, where there's different versions of Blade Runner where there's lots of narration, mostly from Deckard, and there's versions where there's almost none or none at all, and fans are kind of divided on what they prefer. In the 1984 version, Princess Irulan starts the movie with basically an explanation of it's sort of I think of it as the title scroll from Star Wars, just giving a bit of a background. Which, the books actually has a lot of little bits from Princess Irulan throughout, and it actually happens in later books as well, too. But in the new movie, we just get Chani with a little bit at the very beginning. We don't get any inner dialogue of Paul. I think that Timothée Chalamet does a good job of sort of acting this, like, what the heck have I gotten myself into? Or, like, what is this? What is all this stuff happening around me that's impacting me? I think the closest we get is the tent scene. So Jessica and Paul in the desert, and they're inside a still tent, and he has a spice-induced moment of prescience, and he keeps shouting these things. I kind of won't get into it, but they're pretty word for word from the book. And that's the closest we get to, like, him in the book, too. He's thinking these things and saying these things, and his mother's trying to calm him down. And this is a lot of table setting for the second half, which I think was interestingly done. But I will admit, I haven't talked to many people who haven't read the book or even seen the other movie, and they didn't feel that narration was needed. Like, everyone I talked to has basically said, I don't think you need the narration, but it is a workaround when you're adapting a book that's very cerebral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was something interesting where I don't think I missed it in the Villeneuve version, but in the Lynch one, it worked for me to an extent, because it's always nice when you kind of get to see the motivations of different characters. We're normally like, this is the bad guy, they do bad guy things, and that's about it. And you don't really understand any more or less of what their rationale is. And I liked the concept of the inner monologue. The problem was, it would be 2 or 3 lines. In the first line, it would be nice. There'd be a little bit of mystery to it, and then they would over-explain themselves. And it's like, okay, that's just now bad script writing that we're getting into. And it kind of almost got to the point where it was too much of a crutch of, you know what, instead of showing things, we're just going to tell you everything. And that's always a bit of a problem, because in movies, the best movies are ones that show, don't tell. And this was a lot of tell.
And I think that was a huge challenge with, the amount of stuff to cover, the amount of characters that are integral to the story in a lot of ways too. Even just like, hey, the miniseries from 2000, it was 3 2-hours, with commercials, so 3 90-minute parts. And even that left stuff out because it was the only way to do it. There's so much to do. And I think that Lynch was kind of stuck. We, like you said, Jodorowsky, there were a ton of scripts before Lynch's film happened. And then there's been like 3 or 4 different versions of Dune in 1984 since it's been made. The TV version, an unofficial director's cut that has nothing to do with the director, all those types of things. So I think you're right. I think that it's very much it can be helpful, and it worked within the context of the movie. But I think Villeneuve, look at Villeneuve. He took like a 30-page short story in Story of Your Life, which became Arrival, and like a full-length movie that actually is one of the few times when I've seen a movie and I was like, this was significantly better in my opinion than the story, which I also loved too. So I think it's just, it's a challenge. And I think that there's a long story of directors' names attached to a Dune project. For one time, there was Luc Besson, who did Fifth Element and some other science fiction movies that aren't as well known. Ridley Scott was very briefly attached, or nearly attached, and then he did Blade Runner instead. There's been other names over the years, and I think that it's just a challenge. I think Villeneuve kind of is hitting his, he's a highly sought after director, and this was the best time. And this was always his dream anyway. It all kind of came together in a great way. Lynch accepted the project without having ever read the book or even knowing the story.
That's interesting, especially since at the same time he was offered to do Return of the Jedi, which he turned it down.
Yes.
And I don't know, this kind of has a lot of the silly playfulness that Return of the Jedi has. It's sort of interesting that he's like, oh, no, I'm not doing a Star Wars movie. I'm going to do my own sci-fi thing that basically is very similar to what Return of the Jedi is.
And he regrets it. And that's where we are now.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I want to talk very briefly, sort of you hitting on the way Denis Villeneuve uses his scripts and things like that. I'm quickly pulled it up because I was curious. I'm like, he isn't really known for writing his movies, and it looks like he wrote all of his French Canadian films, and then he hasn't written anything since Ensendé until Dune, where he is a co-writer. So that's sort of interesting how, especially Arrival, which took a short story and was managed to be expanded, and Blade Runner 2049, which was building on the world of the original Ridley Scott one and stuff like that. And now he's finally, he didn't have anything to do with the writing of that. And now he's back kind of writing. I don't know how much maybe pen to paper he was actually doing or fingers to keyboard. Maybe he was just there helping to shape the story more than anything. But do you have any insight onto that?
I think that there was, I don't know a ton about it. I think that it was one of those things where Spates and Roth already had a script and he was hired as director and he said, I have to be part of the writing process. And I think that's because, he was very young when he first read Dune and he's seen all like the other adaptations. And there's a quite famous early 90s audiobook. It's like 40 hours, but it's mostly acted. So there's a narrator, but almost all the dialogue, not all of it, but almost all the dialogue is done by actors. And it's very, very, very good. It's just the book, but it's acted quite well. So, I mean, I'm sure he's listened to that many times, maybe like I have. So I think that it was one of those things where he took this, he has this project. He said more than once that he'd like to do 3 films and then go back to smaller movies, possibly forever. I think it's just, this is his passion project. It would be mine if I was a director for sure. So I think that he just needed to be a part of the writing. And I wouldn't be surprised if part of his writing or part of his input was, okay, we need less here, more here. And that was kind of the approach he took.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. I know we've danced around a little bit, and maybe we should start talking a bit more. But some of the characters are in it are done very differently. I think the first one, a character who's in both, is Baron Harkonnen, who in the 2001 version is portrayed by Stellan Skarsgård, and then in the 1984 version we have Kenneth McMillan, and these two characters' portrayals could not be more differently. It's sort of interesting, especially just aesthetically, where in the 84 version, he's basically got this flying suit, but he also has like this pus and acne all over his face. We understand that in the new one, he is sick with something and he keeps having to take these, black milky baths that are very disgusting. But then he also has this ability to get super tall, which is not really discussed in the movie, but I was talking about with my dad, who's a big fan of the book as well. It has to do with something about like gravity suspenders or something like that. So it's just interesting how differently these two characters are played on an aesthetic level, but also on a performance level. It's this over-the-top comical villain in the 84 version, whereas in the 2021 version, he was pretty terrifying. Skarsgård is a very intimidating actor, and I was very impressed with what he chose of how he chose to portray it.
I think you kind of hit it right on the head. In the 2000 miniseries as well, Baron Harkonnen he's still very like evil, blah blah blah, but archetypal evil to the point of almost comedic. This movie, I think Villeneuve even went on record saying he like in the book Harkonnen is he's bad. He's and I think that the 84 movie kind of misunderstood some of the book basically. Like this version is what I visioned him, just like a huge guy. He has the gravity suspenders are built into him. So if you notice some shots from behind, you'll see these like metallic parts along his spine. That's what it is that makes him hover, and that allows him to. There's a point where he's like hovering up at the ceiling. But it's a menacing villain, and the point is to like you want to feel. This is one of the things in Jodorowsky's version, because there's a documentary made about Jodorowsky's attempt, where he also saw Harkonnen as extremely menacing, extremely vile, evil. But one key thing, and this was a huge part of the criticism of the 84 book, or the 84 movie, and it's a problem in the book, is that Harkonnen is meant to be read as gay. Very much more menacingly so in the 84 movie, but it is a part of the book as well, and that's just stripped out of this one. There's an element of it there of him sort of just being a deviant, like whatever that could mean. But it's something looking, watching the 84 movie again, I like roll my eyes. I was like, yes, of course, the one gay character of this entire universe is like ugly as sin and has all these pus and all this stuff. And there's also some things that happen like that the character does. And I can't speak to what Herbert was thinking. Like, I'd like to hope that wasn't a reflection on his views on homosexuality. I mean, there are pretty much no gay characters across the entire book series, but sci-fi writing pretty much didn't have queer characters until people came along and started putting them putting those in those stories. So, not to forgive that, but I think at least this is the properly menacing version of Harkonnen that we're just going to see get more menacing in part 2.
Yeah, I noticed what seemed like as close to explicit queerness as you can get in the 84 version when we're going to talk about him in a little bit, but when Fade, the Sting character, steps out of, I don't know what it was he was stepping out of, and he's basically licking his lips, lusting over him, whereas in the Villeneuve version, that subtext is completely removed. And I wonder if Villeneuve just sort of viewed it as an unnecessary distraction to the story. And, this idea of, we don't need to make the only queer character in this film the bad guy sort of thing. So it's not really adding anything that doesn't need to be there. So let's just sort of scrap that element completely. Because truth be told, what we know about Harkonnen, that doesn't really matter. It's, he seems to just be this megalomaniac, power-hungry person who just wants to control the flow of spice. And that's really what we need to know about his character motivation. Everything else sort of is a bit superfluous.
Right.
But yeah, and then the other thing is obviously characters who appear in the Lynch one that do not appear at all in the Villeneuve one. The big one is Fade, who's played by Sting in his infamous metal bikini bottoms that he wears. Princess Irulan, the Emperor himself, the Guild Navigator. All these characters appear in Lynch's Dune, but do not appear at all in Villeneuve's. Now, is this because much like Peter Jackson removing Tom Bombadil from the Lord of the Rings movies, is this Denis Villeneuve removing them completely from the story, or should we expect to see them in part 2 of Dune? Because interestingly enough, all these characters appear at the very beginning and throughout the film of Lynch's Dune.
Yes, and that was a choice made again as well in the miniseries, but it's not a case in the book. The Guild Navigator we pretty much don't see, I think, more than once. Princess Irulan is just sort of almost like book voiceover, like I said, those little call-outs, and Fade, pops up here and there. Villeneuve's already said Fade will be in the second movie. I think that's like the big casting news that people are waiting for the second movie, and took some elements of Fade to expand the Beast Raban's character in this movie. I think I think Villeneuve at one point said there's already too many people in it. It's one thing already that Chani is an incredibly important character, and she's barely in this movie, but Zendaya is a key part of the marketing, and she's a key part of the story, especially going forward. So we're going to see Irulan, I'm almost certain. We're definitely going to see Fade. I'm not so sure about the Emperor, because the Emperor is part of the story, especially in part 2, but there's not really it can be done without him. I find it really hilarious that I think it was Jodorowsky that wanted Salvador Dali for the Emperor, because the Emperor's piece is so minimal. But there were elements of it done well in the miniseries. I will admit, that sort of kind of set up some of this, inter-house political intrigue. In the new movie, they talk about the Landsrat a lot, but they never actually explain it. It's essentially all the houses. So Atreides, Harkonnen, Carino, which is the Emperor's house, they're all part of this noble houses, like a House of Lords in a way. And there's a hierarchy of them, which is why Atreides getting the fiefdom of Dune is such a significant deal. We don't really need all that detail, because what we're going to get in part 2, again, not going into a ton of detail, and it's some pieces that the Lynch movie sort of glossed over really quickly, is the business side of things that is a little bit more focused on. We hear a lot about, we need to make money. Both Atreides, like Leto saying that, but also Harkonnen saying, we're going to get back Arrakis so we can make money. And that's actually a lot more key than knowing the Imperium's politics in a way.
Interesting. Okay. Now, do we expect to see the return of the metal bikini in Dune 2 from Fade?
Interestingly enough, Fade is described shirtless in the book, which is why partially, he is meant to be very attractive, and I think that's the point, is that the Baron is lusting over his own nephew, which is terrifying. There's some familial stuff that I don't think the movie will dive into too much, of why it's important that Fade is good looking. There's some weird stuff that sort of explains this, but the short version is the Bene Gesserit breeding program that resulted in Paul also resulted in Fade. That's not really a spoiler. It's just part of the story that doesn't really impact much of what happens. But needless to say, the idea is that over hundreds and thousands of years, the Bene Gesserit are trying to perfect people. So I don't know if that means it's a metal bikini. I highly doubt we're going to see something like that. We might see. We're supposed to know that Fade is a good fighter. So however they choose to show that is however Villeneuve chooses to show that, it's completely on him. I've seen a ton of names already tossed around for who could be playing Fade. So who knows? Who knows?
Do you have any preferences of who you think would make a good Fade?
I don't care. I think every single person that Villeneuve cast in this movie is a good actor, and that's the most important thing to me. That was not shade. That was not shade on Sting.
Yeah, he has almost no dialogue in that movie. He basically exists solely to be a good fighter and to look good while doing it, and he accomplishes that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the actor they chose for Fade in the miniseries was better, at least in that regard, is that someone who could act, or at least who could try to act, because acting wasn't a strong suit of that version. Either way, we're going to see this character, and I think Villeneuve just was like, we're only telling half the story. It's like you said, there's a lot of pieces in the book that might be like little tiny bits in the early parts of the book that sort of then characters introduced later. But this is a key thing about literature that I try to remind myself by being a writer and watching movies too. You don't have to introduce all your characters. You can introduce a character in the last third of the book and they can still be important. I find that weird because in a play you would never do that, which is something that still happens. But in writing, it like that character is important when they're important because that's what life is like too. So it'll be interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have any last things you want to discuss of some differences between these before we move over to similarities?
Yeah, one of the key differences I do want to bring up is in kind of, I'll say mostly ship design, but it impacts in the design of the world, which I think we'll talk about in some similarities as well for me too. But the key thing I want to talk about is how very Geiger-ish some of the ships were, like giant spheres with weird shapes, like not quite alien, but one key one for me. So in I think in the 84 version, the Highliners, which are the Guild Navigator ships, were big black sticks, if I'm remembering correctly. Mm-hmm. And then in this movie, they don't actually call them what they are, but you see it a few times. It's a very, very significantly large gray sphere. And then on the inside, you can almost see like a reflection of the planet or something. That is a little closer to description of in the book, but it also just like blew my mind because I just know that the art direction team sat on that for a while. Like, how do we show the scale of these Highliners? Because they are supposed to be gigantic. It's very, very difficult to fold space and actually navigate, which is why spice is so important. And so, of course, they'd have these gigantic ships that can fit. You see these little specks of the ship coming out, and then it hits the ground as huge and has like 1,000 people on it. So it's just something in terms of a key difference that I think that there was a better sense of scale throughout this movie in all sorts of designs that just made sense to me a lot more than I think the 84 movie did. Like there was attention paid to how ornithopters fly and how they're made and all this stuff, which you can do now when you have a $200 million budget and is very different from a $40 million 80s movie.
Yeah, that's good to know.
A beginning is a very delicate time. Know then that it is the year 10,191. In this time, the most precious substance in the universe is the spice melange. The spice extends life. The spice exists on only one planet in the entire universe. The planet is Arrakis, also known as Dune.
All right, let's move over to some similarities between these two movies. And I think for me, one thing that was interesting is, despite the budget differences and despite the, let's call it quality differences, a lot of the designs I found were quite similar, especially the sandworm. Obviously, the new sandworm is all CGI, and the original 84 one looked like it was mostly practical effect with maybe some CGI added onto it, but they look pretty similar, the way they have it set up with all these like rows of teeth circling the inside of the mouth of the sandworm, basically creating kind of like a black hole, which actually reminded me a lot of like a Sarlacc pit in Star Wars, interestingly enough, which ties into the Return of the Jedi thing yet once again. But yeah, is this just both filmmakers really taking the description that Herbert laid out and doing it faithfully?
I think there's an element of that, and it should also be noted that Herbert did write a version of the script that became the 84 movie. Like, his version is nowhere to be seen because he's not a script writer. But I think there's some pieces in there that he may have been Lynch tried to keep him away, and Herbert was respectful in that. But there may have been pieces of, this was the vision I had, and it's also there's a key thing, the Chris knife, which is the knife that they keep showing in visions and stuff in the new movie. It has a certain shape because it's made out of the tooth of a worm. So I think that there was a desire to kind of keep that similar. And I'm pretty sure the Sarlacc pit was inspired by the sandworm, considering that movie came out almost 20 years after Dune did.
Yeah, it was just something that I really noticed. Obviously, the Dune one kind of has like flaps that open the mouth that actually sort of remind me a little bit of the alien pods and Alien too. The way that those eggs sort of open up, very similar, which doesn't surprise me since this is the same era of Ridley Scott's Alien, a few years after, obviously. But yeah, that kind of seemed a bit similar nature to that. But yeah, they were very similar worm styles. And I know, talking about this before we start recording, this is going to be a bit of a contentious subject for you. But I thought the still suits also looked pretty similar.
Yeah, so the still suits did look similar because it's like a dark gray suit. Or like an almost black suit with tubes. That's what it is. But the book, there's quite a lengthy description, especially when Kynes says to Paul early in the movie, have you ever worn a still suit before? And Paul's like, nope, it's my first time. And that's when some of the description comes out to sort of explain why it's difficult to put one on properly, why it's important to close the seals, all these things. In my mind, the Lynch version is just, it's sort of a dark suit and there's a bunch of straws on it. Like it just seems... I think the problem for me is it didn't seem as believable, whereas, I need to believe that someone's going to be in a dark suit in the desert. I think that Villeneuve is just a little bit more spot on to me. But you're right, a still suit is a still suit. If you were to look at the still suits in the 2000 and 2003 miniseries, which also covers the sequels, they also look similar because they're going to. I just think at least there's a higher level of realism, as real as can be, with filming a movie in the desert, with the still suits in the new one. But I agree that there is similarities.
Okay, good, because I mentioned earlier to you, I thought you were going to be very mad at me for bringing it up again. But yeah, they both kind of, with the tubing and the things like that, it just look very similar to that. Obviously, the nostril nose piece for you to breathe out of, so you're not breathing in spice directly, I guess, is just something that's lifted directly from Herbert's text. So you can only do sort of so much with that idea.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's, I think there's also it's kind of like thinking about how a lot of shows have tried to deal with doing COVID and having a mask on an actor's face. There's a lot of, ripping the face part off so you can see the actor act, even in this movie too.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Yeah, they have like these, what basically really look like face masks that we're wearing for COVID in this new movie. And I guess kind of like a scuba mask almost sort of thing. And that isn't present at all in the 84 version, I don't believe.
Just because it's way easier to mic someone, I'm sure, without their mouth being covered.
Probably. Because then you end up in the sort of Tom Hardy realm of let's cover his face up and listen to him not be able to be understood.
Yep.
Now, speaking of saying things, I also found a lot of the dialogue seemed very familiar. Obviously, stuff like "the spice must flow" is probably the tagline for the original book, and so you have to include that. But there's, I watched the 84 version just yesterday, and there's quite a few moments where I'm like, hey, this is basically, beat for beat the exact same dialogue as the new version as well. So I'm sort of curious about how you found the dialogue in the new version. Is it just all like basically lifted directly from the book?
A lot of it is, and it's a lot of, summarizing in a way that fits the characters. The conversation between Jessica and Paul after the Reverend Mother leaves, that's sort of like it's like a shorter version of a longer conversation in the book. But then certain things like Jessica's litany against fear, I must not fear, fear is a mind killer, Kynes seeing the worm and saying, bless the maker and his water, even Harkonnen saying like my Arrakis, my Dune, like there's a lot of things that are exactly like the book. And it's funny because that's another thing Herbert said around the original movie was, these are my words, I'm hearing my words in this movie. And I think that it's a testament to how he sort of built the world and how religion is a really key part of the Dune universe. It's not dive into too much in this movie, and it won't be as much in the second half. other than sort of the direction of Paul's life. But I think there's this component of a religiosity of the Bene Gesserit has been around for thousands of years. So there's these sayings, and there's sayings for the Fremen because they've been there a long time and everything too. So I think that you can't change a lot of those. But then, of course, you have like Duncan, Idaho with that joke that was in the trailer about like Paul putting on some muscle. It's like one of 3 jokes in the whole movie, because this is not a humorous movie. Not that it's the most dry or serious movie either. That's obviously not in the book. I think that it's just, there's certain things that don't need to change. But the good thing is there's also not, I found at least in the 84 one, is that there's a lot of, like you said earlier, just trying to explain something in a single sentence, or just, kind of covering a whole gap with a very brief phrase. But there's definitely going to be a lot of similar language. You'll see a bigger difference for part 2. Like you said, Lynch tried to fit half the book in 45 minutes. Villeneuve's going to take a very different approach.
And so I guess maybe to sort of tie everything together, what should we be looking forward to in part 2 that maybe is not there in Lynch's version?
Yeah, we're going to see a lot more Fremen life. We're especially going to see, it's very important to see Paul and Chani's relationship develop. There's a couple pieces that Lynch still does in terms of, we know that Jessica's pregnant, so we're going to meet the child, and there's some important things and very challenging things to do about how the child is acted, which is another casting thing, but it's like a super young child, so it's not as big of a piece yet. I think that we're going to see a lot more of kind of Paul's visions and how those manifest and where kind of things are going at the end of the book. There's this is also like almost 40-year-old movie. At the end of the 84 Dune, it rains, which pissed me off to no end. It fits the way the movie was made, but that's not the point. Is not that Paul is able to make it rain. The point is that Paul is the product of all these things happening. So he has a role to play. And that role doesn't give him godlike powers. He's playing kind of, Herbert said it as, it's a man playing at God, not a man who has become God, which is then, expanded on in later books that I won't get into because it gets a mess after the 3rd book. But I think what we can see is we better understand who Paul is, how he grows, his relationship with his mother, and especially the relationship with Chani. All of those are important in sort of setting the stage for the actions and the choices he makes. The years later that the second movie will start with I think it'll start immediately after the end of the first one, and then there will be a time skip instead of, there's a couple of things that they need to explain, or it'd be a good idea to kind of touch on before they do the time skip.
Interesting. Yeah. It's funny. I'm watching the Lynch version. I was like, oh, this movie's just The Matrix. Because there's a lot of similarities between Paul Atreides and Neo, I find, as far as the one, which is, a very, oft used hero complex, savior complex sort of thing, where it's just an easy character archetype to follow. By watching, I'm like, oh, I completely understand. It's the Messiah figure.
It is, and there's a lot of problems with it too, because even the original book was criticized. It's very much a white savior thing, but a lot of Paul's internal monologue, and we see glimpses of it in the first movie. I think we'll see more of it in the second. Is that this is not what he wanted. Like, he shouts at his mother, like, "You did this to me," basically meaning like you like, I know that it's because of you and because of this breeding program and stuff. He's not explicitly blaming her, but he's now stuck in this role and he can't do a thing about it. He shouts about, a holy war in my name across the galaxy. He doesn't want that to happen. But what's really interesting about and I don't remember how much the 84 movie dives into this, but at the end of the book, I don't want to give too much away, but he's doing everything he can to fill the role without making it, what everyone else wants him to be. And then Herbert's kind of like, there can be a Messiah, but it has to be the Messiah on their own terms, not so much on what religion or what people expect or want of them. And that's sort of where he turned that sort of chosen one on its head. I'm going to admit, he didn't do the best job, especially with how the later books pan out. And I really do hope Villeneuve gets to make his 3rd movie, because Dune Messiah, which is the 2nd book in the series, is sort of like a coda to the 1st book. And Villeneuve said he'd only adapt that one, because after that, there's a lot of time skipping of the later books. So it sort of closes out Paul's story in a way that sort of reflects on this white savior piece, not the white part, but the savior piece, that I think is better than the, like you said, kind of the Matrix chosen one, you're the one who will solve all our problems type of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's something that's definitely going to come into play, especially when you look at the Fremen people who they cast for that. It's basically all people of color. You know, it's basically led by Javier Bardem and Zendaya. So you've got a lot of people who are either black or Hispanic. So I think that's definitely going to Latino. I think that's going to be something that really comes into play, and I wonder if they're going to grapple with that.
And it has to, because in the books, the Fremen are descended from the Zen Sunni wanderers, which were all perceived to be people of color. So, and these people live in the desert. So I think that there's just there's things that can't be avoided that the other adaptations have tried to.
Yeah. I don't doubt for a second that it's going to be something that will probably be addressed, because I don't think you can make a movie this day and age where you have those types of characters and it's not at least acknowledged.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Do you have any other similarities you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like. So the 1984 film is more colorful. Is probably something you've noticed. The new movie is more realistic. It's a sand planet. There really isn't a blue sky because there's no pools of water above ground. So the 84 one doesn't have a ton of blue sky, but there's color. There's specific color grading. Caladan is like dark blue gray, whereas in the new one, Caladan just looks like a what, like it looks like Ireland or England, which is likely where it was filmed. They try to make things a little bit more realistic, but I think there's a similarity, at least in the Dune is this color. When you see the Fremen, these are sort of the general, other than the blues of their eyes, you're seeing sort of this like in the shadows type of thing. You're seeing fog when you're seeing the Bene Gesserit. I think that there's some similarities where David Lynch went a little bit more, strong color grading. All of the scenes in Harkonnen, like at Getty Prime, is like orangey, reddish, quote unquote, like hot evil colors. And then we're seeing Caladan that's more of the cool colors and things like that. And that was made even more so obvious in the 2000 version. But I think at least that is a similarity that I like, is that I'm saying it's a difference and a similarity, that the way that each director has played with color has been, I think, good in a way. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing is that both films lent a lot to Jessica. Jessica's an important character. If you probably noticed by looking at the cast list and watching the movie, there are very few women. Kynes is written as a man in the book, but I think actually worked extremely well as a woman, and specifically as a woman of color who identifies as a Fremen, even though she may not have been born as a Fremen. It works well in the movie. But Jessica is an extremely important character, and I think is done very well in both movies. She's not given as much in the 84 film, but you can still see, like, she is a commanding presence. She is. To me, she's more of the star of the movie than even Kyle MacLachlan is, because he was just a baby at this point. So, still a fairly new actor. He had done some stuff at that point. So I do like that as a similarity of giving Jessica. She's better acted in the new one. I love Rebecca Ferguson. I think that there's a lot more nuance to her. There's a lot of fear in her, which is not explained a lot, which I kind of like. But I do think, at least in both, that they were done very well.
Mm-hmm. I thought the Jessica character was a very interesting one, because she seems like such a complicated person, because on one hand, she basically is a witch and has these powers and is a part of a secret society that is basically doing selective breeding of how to create a savior down the line. But then she also at times seems a little weak and powerless. So it's just such an interesting dichotomy of what this character is, and when she chooses to use her powers and when she chooses to be, I guess, quote unquote, more subservient, is a very interesting one. And I think Rebecca Ferguson really does a great job of sort of balancing those two characteristics of her.
Yeah, because there's a lot of problems with the character, it just from a concept, she's a concubine. She's not the Duke's wife. But she fell in love with him, and they love each other. And it's not really explicitly said, which is fine. It's more that he says, you bore me a son, even though you weren't supposed to, because the whole point is she was supposed to have a daughter. And what was, without going into it, is their daughter and someone else's son, also selectively chosen, that their son was going to be this ultimate savior. So like, she screwed things up, but she did it because she loves her husband, or sorry, I even said she loves the Duke. And I think to try to do that in a meaningful way, like as it's explained in the book, is that she basically grew up in the Bene Gesserit and then was just given. She was just given to the Duke, and that's it. Like, this is who you live with now. You are the concubine. You will bear a daughter. Go. So I think giving her some agency, but I think this movie also was like, she's super conflicted about who she is, what she's done, how and when she uses her powers. And I think, we don't see a lot of the Bene Gesserit, but what we do see, like, you just know there's some of them that are just using their powers left, right, and center. And that is true because that's what they've been doing sort of in the shadows for thousands of years.
Yeah, I almost feel like I want to comment on it a bit more. I feel like in the Villeneuve version, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think they make it explicitly as clear that she's just the Duke's concubine, whereas in Lynch's version, it is very explicit that that's what their relationship is, that they're not married, that she's basically just the Duke's property, whereas in the Villeneuve version, they almost play it off like they are a married couple. Like, she's always there for, like, the important ceremonial things, stuff like that. It really seems like she has equal power to the Duke as well. So that's something interesting, and I don't know.
That's more like the book, actually. That's more like the book of, the society sees it as she's his property, but he sees it. They both see it as they are married, and but there's obvious issues with that even from a political standpoint. But that's why her title is Lady. She's the Lady Jessica. Like, she's not the Duchess. She's not her husband. His wife, Matt. I mean, so. But I agree that is. I forgot that in the 84 one they make that a bit more explicit. But I think it's important to see that, knowing Leto's fate, like, of what, we don't see a lot of them together, but when we see them together, we kind of get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I'd also maybe love to sort of talk a bit about the Paul Atreides character, both of them, Timothée Chalamet and Kyle MacLachlan. I feel like they both were kind of bringing a very similar energy to their characters. They have this angsty teen vibes to them, but at the same time understanding that there are things bigger and greater than them that they may be destined to do. I didn't mind both of their performances. If anything, I think Kyle MacLachlan brought a bit more energy to the character that Timothée Chalamet did not have. But what did you think of the two of them?
I agree, and it's funny that we've kind of gone almost this whole thing not talking about Paul, the main character of the movies. I completely agree with you. I think they bring very different things. I think Kyle MacLachlan, I agree, brings energy. He brings this sort of like, okay, well, this is the role I'm playing. I'm just going to make it happen, and that's going to work. And I think he was a good casting choice for this role, and I know he awakened some things in me when I was a child when I saw the movie for the first time. But all that said, I think Chalamet is very, very good, given how young he still looks, to be the angsty teenager. Because it's very important, like in the book, especially in the first part of the book, he is miserable. Oh, do we have to? Why are we doing this? I've learned everything. Just let me fight. Like, whatever. Come on, Dad. Whatever. Like, that pretty much is his character. He's kind of a loser through much of, and then we see his time among the Fremen and all this stuff and all these roles he needs to start filling, these things he learns and develops, and he grows. And I think that's a key thing. We're going to see a very different Paul in much of part 2, where we're not really given the chance in the 84 film. Yeah, we see a bit of Kyle MacLachlan being like, oh, why do I have to? And then, okay, I guess I'm the hero now. Like, there's a bit more of that, and it just, whereas there's a lot more confliction, and you can see a lot of the confliction in Timothée Chalamet's face later in this movie. As things goes on, he sort of realizes what's happening, what he has to do. The way he tries to take control in the desert, and sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And then even in sort of the climax of this movie, him stepping up to defend his mother, you can see in his face, he's like, do I do this? What do I do? And then he doesn't realize what, the outcome is going to have to be of this form of defense. And I think that Chalamet captures that nuance a little bit better, especially as like a few months ago, he was just an angsty teen. And he's still that, but now he has to be more. And I think Kyle MacLachlan doesn't get enough time to develop in that way.
Interesting. And looking at both of them, they both were 25 approximately when they're filming. They were probably 24, 25. But yeah, they were 25 when the movies should have came out, if we're counting the fact that Dune was supposed to come out last year, not this year.
Yeah, and I think, you have to choose someone who is on the younger end. The actor they chose, who I thought actually did a pretty good job for the miniseries, was older, and there was a lot of comment like he did not play a teenager well. Like, it was very Dear Evan Hansen movie a little bit. But he's only a teen for a part of the story, and then he's an adult, and even especially Dune Messiah like takes place much later. So if Villeneuve wants to make that, we're gonna have to find a way for Chalamet to look 10, 15 years older than he does now, and I'm sure there's a way to do that. But yeah, I think it's funny because as you said at the beginning, a lot of the story takes place in Paul's head. It's just him dealing with things and what spice awakens in him, and who learning who he actually is, or who other people think he's going to be. How do you show that in your face? How do you show that without telling it? And I think, at least to the credit of Chalamet, he doesn't get voiceovers to do that. He just has to find a way to do it by being this kind of like deer in headlights half the time.
Mm-hmm. I think also one thing that was interesting is both films have pretty stacked casts. We're looking at the David Lynch version. Obviously, Colin McLaughlin, that was his first movie, but has since gone on to, be a bit of a cult star, especially with his role in Twin Peaks. And there's a lot of David Lynch regulars in this movie as well. But it also has Jose Fer, who plays the Emperor, Brad Dourif, who plays Piter, and Sting in a small role, Patrick Stewart as Gurney, and there's quite a few pretty prominent actors in this movie. And of course, you look through the cast list of the new Dune movie, and it's equally as stacked. You got Oscar Isaac and Rebecca Ferguson, Zendaya, Jason Momoa, Stellan Skarsgård, Josh Brolin, Javier Bardem, Dave Bautista, on and on and on. So it's interesting that this work obviously resonates with performers in such a way that they're willing to be a part of a greater ensemble, even if they themselves have a small part. And I think they understand this idea, the concept of just because you don't have a large part doesn't mean your character is not incredibly important to the story.
Yeah, I mean, people want to be in Dune. That's just, I think it's one of those things that, I'm sure a lot of these actors, most of these actors, saw Villeneuve getting the directing role in 2017, and I wouldn't be surprised if Timothée Chalamet's agent or manager or even him himself was like, you need to be in this movie. There's no argument, you need to. A lot of people wanted to be. What's really interesting is Oscar Isaac, he knows he's only in it for one movie, but Jason Momoa in particular, Duncan is a character. It's really hard to explain, but Duncan kind of shows up in almost every book in the series, regardless of his fate. And I don't believe that's a spoiler by any means, because it has nothing to do with the second part of this movie. But, if this becomes a massive franchise, Jason Momoa is doing this for the next 40 years because there's so many stories. But I think that, it's one of those things that Villeneuve has made a name for himself. And Lynch had started to make a name for himself quite a bit as well in his time. I think it's just, people see this prestigious project and they want to be a part of it. But I think another component of this is a lot of people who know Dune know that if you're not one of a few characters, you also don't have to, you're not in the middle of the desert for 6 months. You're maybe there for a month filming what you need to do as well. So I think that there's a component of that too. I have to say I love this cast, but I also do love the cast of the 80s one. I just love that Patrick Stewart was Gurney and how wildly different the Gurney was in this movie. Apparently there was, Gurney's supposed to be a musician. That's a key part of his character, and he's highly, highly religious. So he quotes Bible verses and stuff all the time. There's bits of that, but there apparently were 2 songs written for Josh Brolin, and they just never even got filmed. And I have to wonder if he's just a horrible singer, and that was why, or they just couldn't fit it in. Villeneuve's been very clear that there is no director's cut, because what we see is the director's cut. So I don't think we'll ever get to see that, aside from maybe, an audio piece on the Blu-ray or something like that. But the other piece of, I don't remember. No, I don't think it was Gurney. I'm pretty sure it was Hawat, who had the giant eyebrows in the 84 version. That is its own star as well. If that's
Thufir.
Oh yeah, Thufir Hawat had the giant eyebrows, and then instead in the new version we get the lovely parasol.
Yeah. And even who's the other character that had the giant eyebrows? It was Piter in the original one, whereas Piter in the new version is he has alopecia, which looks like all the Harkonnens have alopecia.
Yes, and I think they were also trying to, in the old one, trying to show, these 2 are mentats. In this one, Thufir and Piter both have the black bit on their lip. It's hard to sort of, in the book you can be like, this person's a mentat, so now we know they're a mentat, and that's all we need to know. And funny enough, it's not really explained in the new movie, but mentats are basically human computers. And we see a glimpse of that with Hawat kind of doing a calculation really quickly, because thinking machines are outlawed. So even the only glimpse of any kind of machine we see in the whole movie that's not directly human controlled is Paul's video books, and those are just pre-recorded holograms. Like there's no like, hey, computer, do this. And the whole thing is that thousands of years before, there was a big war between thinking machines and humans, and that sort of left the universe as it is now. But I think it's neat that they don't really need to explain what a mentat is, but can still sort of show it.
Yeah, because he does this thing where they talk about how long he must have traveled or something like that when the delegation arrives to award the Duke with Arrakis and Thufir Hawat. His eyes roll back behind his head, and basically has these like milky white eyes, and you see him basically doing the mental calculations in his head, and his eyes roll back down, and like he says how long they must have traveled or something like that.
Yeah, and that's a good show not tell thing. It's not super vital.
Exactly.
In the book, Paul trains with Hawat to kind of learn mentat things, whereas mentats go to like this really intensive schooling to learn, and you need to have a certain kind of brain for it. It's not super important at this stage. They might bring it up later. It's not super vital, but see, like Hawat and Piter are both important characters because mentats, as they are, it's part of the universe building. I think Villeneuve was just like, these are people. They're here. This is the thing they do. On to the next thing.
Okay, I think we did a great job sort of breaking down the similarities and differences and really just kind of going over it. This is a movie where I liked it when I watched it, the new one. I came out of the theater really appreciating a lot of the design. The look of it was fantastic. The performances were all great. But because I hadn't read the book, a lot of it kind of was a bit confusing to me. And when they kind of were getting into the weeds of this is the political background and this is what's going on, it kind of lost me a little bit. I really liked the introduction. And then once they landed on Arrakis, it kind of lost me for quite a bit until the siege and everything afterwards. That was all super interesting. But it was that big chunk in the middle where it just kind of like glazed over me a little bit, where I just wasn't really feeling the emotional connection to the film. But I think talking it out with you, and especially watching the Lynch version and realizing how much better Villeneuve's version is, helped me appreciate it too.
I totally understand where you're coming from, because if I hadn't read the book, I think, there's a part where Paul goes and talks to the groundskeeper who's watering the date palms that definitely should not be on Arrakis. And I'm just like, if somebody didn't know the book or like didn't know anything about this story, this would be the lull for them. Absolutely. And that's basically what you described. Like, they're there. We don't really know much. We go, there's the important moment where they go to to rescue the crew at the spice collector. And Paul has that first prescience. He says, I hear your footsteps, old man, which is referring to the worm. And those are important pieces, but there's also not a ton of context. It's sort of just, it might just seem like a little action, or it might just seem, these are people, we need to meet kinds, blah, blah, blah. But you're right. In comparison, especially, it's like, okay, these are very different. These are very different movies, and they're handled in very, very interesting ways. And I also like the book doesn't include Duncan Idaho's kind of last stand. And I love that they kind of managed to get that extra fight choreography in there. I think they did a good job with that as well.
Yeah, that was a real highlight for me, and I like how they did a little bit of foreshadowing at the beginning of the movie when Paul says, I see your death, and Duncan is very dismissive of it, and then we're not sure how it all ends up coming together, and then when you start seeing that sequence play out, you understand where it was and how Paul's premonition came to be.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, we saw some glimpses of different future elements of Paul. I hope that this movie will do good justice of, showing us those scenes as they really happen, or see how Paul tries to avoid certain things from happening, because that's part of his, oncoming prescience of trying to keep things from happening the way he sees them. And I think, I'm glad. All this said, there's a lot of heady, weird stuff that happens. This was very much a precursor to a lot of other science fiction, as you can probably imagine. And I think that there's high hopes for the second part. I have, even if it's a terrible movie, I know I'm going to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like for the most part, audiences were so on board with this version that hopefully it will allow Villeneuve and his fellow writers the freedom to do what they need to do to make the movie right, that they're not going to just acquiesce to what they think the studio will want or what they think the public will want, that they'll allow them to go in the weird direction that Frank Herbert clearly was writing about in his original novel. That was such an inspiration behind David Lynch and the rest of his team working on that film. And it'll be very interesting to sort of see where they go with it. And especially, like we had talked about at the beginning, they set up all the main characters. We know all the players. We understand what's happening. And like, even if you haven't watched the 84 version, when this Dune ends and they meet up with the Fremens and they're going into the desert, you basically know, great, they're going to have to basically rally troops together to figure out how to defeat the incoming Harkonnens, because they're definitely going to come back to make sure that they can claim Arrakis. Like, just by understanding how plot works, you understand that's what's going to happen next.
They said desert power enough times for you to know what desert power means and what they're going to be after.
Yes.
I think the other thing in terms of the next movie is people are going to read the book. More people that have never read the book before. You know, some critics were lamenting that this wasn't a blockbuster because at the time of recording, it hasn't hit 100 million domestic. I think it will. I think it's going to have a little bit of legs. But it also did very well overseas because Dune's not just a North American book. Like, people have read it, but I think the second movie is going to have that unusual sequel benefit of this appetite. People watch this movie, they want to know what happens next. They read the book, and then they really want to see this version of Paul that they know. They want to see how this concludes. I'm not going to say it's going to make $1 billion because I doubt that's going to happen, but I think it's going to drum up more interest in a more unique way than this first one did. Because they're like, you know, among fans before the pandemic, there was a real concern that this was going to be a major flop, like a $10 million opening weekend and then disappear off the face of the earth. So obviously HBO Max helped in the States a little bit, and I think the overseas enthusiasm is very, very high as well.
Yes, absolutely. I can easily see how part 2 will probably make more money, and not just because of the fact that we're still in COVID times and some people are hesitant to go to theaters, which I think will definitely be an added bonus. But this definitely seems like the type of movie that is going to have a bit of legs, where maybe people are going to wait until it's available on streaming. I know in the US you can watch on HBO Max, but nowhere else yet can you stream it so easily. And I think as people are sort of discovering and being like, well, I didn't read the book, so I don't want to watch this in theaters. I don't want to spend my money on this. But hey, you know what? Now it's on Netflix. Now it's on, you know, Amazon Prime, wherever it ends up going to. It will encourage more people to watch it. And then by the time part 2 comes out in a few years, enough people have seen it go, great, now I want to see how it ends.
And don't forget the inevitable Oscar nominations. I can't say from watching this movie that there'll be any acting noms, to be perfectly honest. I thought the acting was spectacular, but I don't know what the Academy will be looking for in this movie, but there will be technical nominations for sure. Maybe quite a few technical wins. It's very hard to film in the desert, for instance, and make sand convincing. I think there was some CGI help with the sand for sure. So I think that will renew interest. I remember that that's happened with movies that are sort of kind of, you know, not forgotten, but then they kind of come up. You know, this could be just purely as an appreciation of what Dune is to science fiction. This could be a Best Picture nomination. I don't think it will be, but who knows?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting where, like, it looks to be the absolute front runner for categories like sound design, visual effects, costume design, production design.
But not music. We're not even talking about that. But if they nominate for music, I'm not so sure I feel good about them winning music. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. But you're right. It's going to be a technical... It'll sweep nominations for technical awards for sure.
And yeah, and could even potentially win them as well. I would not be shocked. And then you look at, maybe it is a bit of a long shot as getting into Best Picture or even as Best Director, depending on how things are going for other movies. Maybe less so Director, but it probably will squeak in there as like the 8th or 9th movie for Best Picture, all things considered, if they want to sort of keep a quote-unquote blockbuster in the running.
I can see it happening, and I'm sure you and I will talk about the nominations when they come out.
Absolutely. Well, I think that wraps up our conversation. Sammy, thank you for coming on. It was a real pleasure for you to kind of help me fill in some of the gaps that I didn't quite know what I was missing, and getting to talk about these two versions of the same movie was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me, and I'm always happy to talk about Dune and the Academy Award-winning film Suicide Squad. I managed to get it in there.
Oh, damn it, Sammy. I thought we made it all the way through.
So close.
Well, so very close. But you can follow this show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. And if you saw both versions of Dune, let us know what you think of the similarities and differences of them. Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music, and Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there too. Thanks for checking us out.